and welcome to our interview series for our MOOC, our massive open online course, Europe Without Borders. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by our distinguished guest, who is David Vaughan.
Hello.
Hello. And David is a writer, a broadcaster, a journalist and a university lecturer. He's been based in Prague in the Czech Republic for roughly 30 years. And his interests are many and varied, including Czechoslovak history in the interwar period, and David has written about that, especially the role of broadcast media and the lead up to the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. As a radio correspondent, David travelled widely in the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Ukraine, and has interest in the history, the politics, the culture of all of these places. So, David, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
So since we are here in Prague and we're filming this interview in Prague, I do want to start with Czech culture and specifically Czech literary culture. Well, we'll find out if it's Czech literary culture. But so was Franz Kafka, right, a famous son of Prague, was Franz Kafka a Czech writer?
That's a great question. By most people's definition, he isn't a Czech writer for the simple reason that he didn't write in Czech. Mm-hmm. He was born in Prague at a time in the 1880s when the city was overwhelmingly Czech-speaking, okay, but there was a German-speaking minority to which he belonged. His family came from the area not far from Prague, which was also predominantly Czech-speaking, but they also spoke German. But the whole family would have, despite having German as their native tongue, would have also spoken very good Czech. Mm-hmm. The very name Kafka is actually a Czech word with a slightly different spelling, Kafka with a V. It means jackdaw.
Okay.
And the family was Jewish as well, which is also another factor. And Kafka, as a writer, and personally was very interested in his Jewishness. He also took an interest in Zionism. And so the answer to that question is very complicated. And of course, also, you have to ask the question, well, if he's writing in German, is he a German writer? And he never lived in Germany. He was born in Prague at a time when it was part of the Austrian Empire. He had, after Czechoslovakia came into being, he had a Czechoslovak passport. And so he was never a German. And also, by the definition, by Hitler's ultra-nationalist definition of what makes a German, because he was Jewish, of course, he was also not defined as a German. So I think the answer to the question is that, like so many great writers, he belongs in several places at once, and that's probably what makes Kafka such a great writer.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. I mean, several places at once, and then the kind of tragic side is in somehow nowhere, right?
And also somewhere, because he was born and lived all his life in Prague, which is really quite provincial in a sense. Yeah. So he's both a world citizen and a person who didn't travel a great deal. He travelled within Austro-Hungary, he travelled to Berlin, but Prague was always his home. So it wasn't as if he wasn't rooted, it was just that he was an outsider.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. And so, I want us to kind of get into these issues about national identity and language and culture and, and the kind of relation between the Czech nation and the German nation. But so, is there a Czech, because you point out, of course, rightly, that he wrote in German and yes, that in some ways excludes him from being a Czech writer, but is there a Czech national literature in German?
Basically, the simple answer to that is no. Because at the time of the Czech national revival through the 19th century, when Czech really re-emerged as a literary language, it was pretty much what defined Czech literature was the fact that it was in Czech. And there were many people who spoke both languages, but their Czechness they would define through writing in Czech. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they were all living in the same place. Everybody was at home in the same place, whether they spoke Czech or German. So there's a huge cross-fertilization between German and Czech in terms of the literature. And there was a rivalry which was, for most of the history of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was mostly friendly. It wasn't, it was not, well, friendly is a slight exaggeration, but there was this non-violent rivalry
not hostile, between, would you say?
Not hostile.
Okay.
There was a degree of hostility, and also historically, there's so many figures in the history of these lands, Bohemia and Moravia, that are shared. You know, for example, the Emperor Charles IV in the 14th century, who both German speakers and Czech speakers would be happy to claim as their own. And so it is an interesting question. I mean, and writers were interested to a certain extent what was going on, what Czech writers were interested in, what German writers were writing, German writers in German were interested in what Czech writers were writing. But there was also a tendency with this competition, there was also a tendency for Czechs at the time of the national revival to look elsewhere, to think, you know, we want to come out of these years of dominance by the German language, so we're going to look further. And so, for example, there was a huge amount of interest in the beginning of the 20th century in French culture and literature, and art. For example, Cubism became a major movement here. Surrealism, which also had its roots in France, became a major element in Czech literature and art. And people would travel to Paris. Guillaume Apollinaire, the French poet, famously came to Prague and fell in love with Prague, which was something that also was an impulse to Czechs to take an interest in French poetry. And also there was an interest in Britain, there was an interest in America, in American culture, not least because the American president Woodrow Wilson played a significant role in the fact that Czechoslovakia came into being in 1918, and so there was a sense of identity or gratitude as well to the Americans.
Okay, yeah. So, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned Cubism, and of course, Prague is famous as one of the few places that has examples of Cubist architecture, right? So yeah, that's and yeah. So you've kind of established, and so language then is really central to this project of Czech nation building, right? Which is not inevitable. You know, you take another case like Ireland, right, where the national literature is to a large extent in English, right? So it's not kind of inevitable, but obviously that was central to Czech nation building. And so, you know, that's what I wanted to ask about, again, this relationship between the Czech nation and the German nation. You know, to what extent was the Czech nation, could you say, built in opposition to the German nation, right? This is what we are not.
Again, I've never addressed that question a bit already, but I think that there was, for a start, it's not necessarily the German nation. We're talking about Austro-Hungary.
Yes.
And there is a clear distinction between Austro-Hungary as this very complex state of many identities, many languages, many cultures, many religions, and it wasn't necessarily German, despite the predominant language or the language of government being mainly German. So the question of this opposition between Czech and German is more complicated in that respect. Also, traditionally German was the language of Prague's Jews as well. So there's yet another level.
Yes.
And yet, at a time when in various parts of Europe there was this revival of interest in national identities.
And again, sorry, we're dating nations. This to, you know, like the late 19th century.
We're going back to the beginnings of the 19th century. It sort of started with theatre, and it started with this shift from Czech being a language that had survived in the country to becoming an urban language. And really, in the space of just 2 generations, in the course of the 19th century, Czech went from being the minority language in Prague to being the language of the overwhelming majority.
Yeah, that's fascinating, in 2 generations. So this is a concerted nation building.
It was a concerted nation building, but people would have still spoken German to a greater or lesser extent as well, because there was a significant German-speaking minority, and also there was power. The power was in Vienna.
Yes, as you mentioned, the language of administration of the imperial capital, right, in Vienna.
And it's also, I think, a reason why there was such a huge Czech blossoming of culture in the second half of the 19th century. If you think about 2 of the best known of all Czechs are composers, Bedřich Smetana and Antonín Dvořák, from that period. And I think that was partly because as long as the seat of power was in Vienna, then the way that you could, in an unrestricted way, express your nationhood was through culture And you only just have to look, for example, just behind us, that extremely grand building is the National Museum, and it was really a gesture of Czech pride in their nation.
When was that built?
That was built in the 1880s, and so it's also an expression not only of Czech pride, even though it had its roots in a more inclusive Bohemian Czech and German identity, but that's going further back in its history. So on the one hand, it's a gesture of Czech pride in the city and the nation. Also, it's a symbol of wealth.
Yes.
It's a fact that, we're not only a nation, but we're also doing rather well.
Yes.
Look at the gilding.
Yeah.
And that was a major factor in the Czech national revival as well in the 19th century, that this part of Central Europe was developing very quickly in terms of industry.
Okay. Well, so of course you're right to point out that, the Czech nation was carving its place in the context of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So carving out its place within that multinational empire. But of course, then that empire collapses at the end of the First World War, and then you do have Germany as the predominant power in Central Europe. And so now I want to I want to try to make a link between this period and the present, right? So, then of course you have the rise of Nazism, Hitler coming to power, and a very, extreme ethnic nationalism, right? And again, you've written about this period. So, part of how Hitler justified first the annexation of the Sudetenland, right, in 1938, shortly followed by the invasion and the annexation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Part of how Hitler justified that was on the basis that Czechoslovakia was and Czechoslovakia, of course, created in 1918 from the ruins of the Habsburg Empire, that this was not a real nation, right? The Czechs were not a real nation. These were historically German lands, right, populated by Germans. And, to bring it to the present, I also, I want to ask you whether you see parallels between this kind of language and rhetoric and the kind of language and rhetoric that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, uses about Ukraine, right? This is not a real nation. These are not real people. This is Russian land, Russian people.
There are very clear parallels. I mean, it's interesting that if you look at the recent history of Ukraine and the recent history, and the history of Czechoslovakia after the First World War, what you have is a dramatic event that led to a change in the status quo. Here, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to the creation of Czechoslovakia. Yes. With Ukraine came into being because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes. And there was a new reality that was created. And of course, what happened was, for most Czechs, this was seen as a process of national emancipation. And Czechoslovakia, it's true, of course, that there isn't a Czechoslovak nation. Mm-hmm. There was an attempt in the 1920s and 1930s to suggest that there was. But on the other hand, to suggest that Czechs and the Czech nation were in some way German is quite simply wrong. This country has an immensely complex and interesting and fascinating history, which is predominantly Slav, but also has a German element, also has a Jewish element, also has all sorts of other bits and pieces. Half the Baroque buildings in Prague were built and designed by Italians. This is a place, a crossroads in Europe, where it has many, many different influences. And it's the same with Ukraine as well, that you have a country which has a very rich and complex history, which is closely connected with Russia, but also had centuries of history that were part of had other influences, such as Poland, Lithuania, Austria. There are many different nations within Ukraine, the territory of today's Ukraine. There's the Hungarian minority, Bulgarians, Romanians, Jews. There are so many different elements that make up today's Ukraine. And what we also see that's similar between the 1930s here and today in Ukraine is that you see this, the more powerful neighboring country, Russia now, yes. Germany then, suddenly or gradually becoming increasingly authoritarian, increasingly ultra-nationalist, and inventing a simplifying agenda, national agenda, saying history is this. History isn't the complexities that make up the relationships between nations, but history is this. If the reality on the ground is different, that's because history has gone wrong, and we have to put it right.
So we have to put it on the correct
and
path.
in order to put it on the correct path, we either have to change the minds of people by changing their mindset, by whatever ways we choose, or we have to do it by creating new realities on the ground, which is what both Hitler and President Putin did. Hitler by annexing Austria and then the Sudetenland and then occupying the whole of this country, or the whole of Bohemia and Moravia, and Vladimir Putin by firstly annexing Crimea and eastern parts of eastern Ukraine, and then trying to invade the whole country. There are direct parallels, and I think we should be very clear in stressing that and stressing the immense dangers that come out of that, and we're already seeing it in the many thousands of people who are being killed at the moment in Ukraine because of a false idea.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're right to point out that the reality, the historical reality in truth is complexity, right? Complexity and nuance, because unfortunately I think there can be a tendency that a lot of people want a simple narrative, right? So then this becomes a kind of an effective tool.
And it's also interesting that, I mean, that the Czechs, there was always a rivalry between the Czech and the German languages, and between Czechs and Germans, although it's complicated because this was Austria, it wasn't Germany. But it was always within certain limits. And in the same way, I mean, Russia is not Ukraine's traditional enemy. If you look at the history of the 20th century, Ukraine had a far more problematic and violent relationship with Poland than with Russia. And yet, what happens is if somebody comes with an agenda which is ultra-nationalistic and doesn't accommodate these similarities and differences, then you have no choice but to reject it. And that's what happened with in Czechoslovakia. It's also one of the impulses for the tragedy of what happened to the German minority in Czechoslovakia after the Second World War, that the Czechs said no more, and
they were essentially expelled
them in ways that were often very brutal.
Yes.
Depending on how things develop in Ukraine, I mean, there's a real danger as well that there will be a huge backlash against the Russian language and against people who maybe identify themselves culturally as Russian, but not necessarily politically. And that's something. What place will they have in the future Ukraine if Ukraine wins the war? Which I mean, I think we all just have to be doing our best to help Ukraine to win this war.
Yeah, so, I want to come more directly to that, right, the impact of the war. And again, kind of sticking to our theme of language and culture, because you're working on a project now about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting language, right? So can you say
Not exactly.
That?
I mean, it's broader than that. I'm interested in language and nationality and nationhood in a broader sense. But the impulse for my taking an interest obviously was in the shifting reality over the last 2 years in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, and the fact, because I think what I was fascinated by was because I spent quite a lot of time in Odessa in southern Ukraine, the great Black Sea port of Odessa in the 1990s, and I always rather took it for granted that this is a predominantly culturally Russian city. Because Russian was a predominant language, and writers associated with cities such as Isaac Babel or Konstantin Paustovsky were writing in Russian. Pushkin was exiled to Odessa, and yet it was also at the same time, we talk about complexity. This was a city with a wonderfully rich mixture of different languages. It was the most cosmopolitan city in the Russian Empire in the 19th century, where there were French and Italian and Greek traders. There were more rights granted to Jews than in other parts of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. And it had a very large Jewish population. And it was a very cosmopolitan city, but with Russian as the lingua franca. And that was still more or less the case in the early days of this century. Even after,
so still kind of post-Soviet.
even after Ukraine had come into being, it was Ukraine. Of course, Odessa was part of Ukraine, and there was a very strong Ukrainian element in Odessa itself. And I think that people in Odessa felt a mixed identity. They felt quite, in many ways, I think most people felt quite happy with this ambivalence of being a bit Ukrainian, a bit something else. And what happened, I think, first of all, with the invasion in 2014, and then with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and once Russian shells started falling on Odessa, this beautiful city, 19th century city, I think that the vast majority of people of Odessa realized this, as the academic Tom Duval put it, this ambivalence became a luxury.
Yes.
And that we have to make a choice, and that the vast majority chose to be Ukrainian, to identify with Ukraine. And this is showing itself. I haven't been to Odessa recently, but I've been told again from talking to my friend and the academic Thomas Duval, who said that there is this huge shift, certainly in public discourse, towards Ukrainian, while people at home would still be speaking Russian with their families or whatever, or their friends. But there is this sense of Ukraine is where we belong. We do not want to be part of Putin's Russia by any stretch of the imagination.
So sorry, I mean, can it be said in a way then that the war is having a kind of a nation-building effect? I mean, the nation of Ukraine, in its most recent iteration, has only existed since 1991, right, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is this having a nation-building effect? And what kind of nation?
You're talking about the state rather than the nation.
The state rather than the nation,
yes. I mean, I have to be cautious because I haven't been to Ukraine since the war broke out, and I think there have been huge shifts. But clearly what we're seeing with Volodymyr Zelensky is a kind of liberal nationalism.
Okay.
Which at the moment certainly seems to be the prevailing tone politically. And Ukraine has expressed a very clear aspiration to join the European Union, which should also be an impulse to continue on that path, as long as the European Union also continues in its commitment to Ukraine. But obviously, there are, as there are in any country, there are other forces, there are other forms of patriotism or nationalism that are always present. There is always the shadow of the Second World War anywhere in Europe.
Yes.
And there certainly is in Ukraine more than in most places. And you only have to look at the deeply problematic role of the Ukrainian nationalist leader from the time of the Second World War, Stepan Bandera, who was directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of many thousands of Poles and Jews.
Yes.
And this is a problematic legacy that Ukraine is going to have to deal with. But I hope that Ukraine will be able to come out of this war stronger and aware of its own multicultural identity. You know, it's also the land of the great writer Sholem Aleichem, you know, who was writing in Yiddish. You know, this is the world that Joseph Roth writes about. It's an incredibly rich, culturally rich part of the world, and that's what makes Ukraine so uniquely European.
And Zelensky himself is Jewish and a Russian speaker, right?
Yes, I mean, that's full of the paradoxes. Zelensky is a really interesting example, being partly Jewish, being a native Russian speaker. I've spoken to many Ukrainians who are in Prague at the moment, either by choice or as refugees. And quite often they'll talk about this fact that they've been rediscovering their Ukrainian identity, because a lot of Ukrainians, for example, in Kiev, would have had Russian as their native tongue, and they've been, and that's not so much because of identifying as Russians, but because they were Soviets, and the Soviet Union was dominated by Russian, the Russian language, and there's been this, you could say, a kind of national revival in the sense that we saw in the 19th century. So
there are these
Prague.
parallels, as you said before.
It's another parallel where people who have grown up as Russian speakers are proudly becoming Ukrainian speakers, proudly taking an interest in their Ukrainian identity. Sometimes it's led to some really quite problematic things, such as tearing down statues of the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, for example. On the other hand, again, I was speaking recently to Tom Duval, who's written about this, and he pointed out that it's not Pushkin's fault so much as the people who used Pushkin as a symbol of the Russian Empire.
Yes. Right.
And in fact, Pushkin, if anything, he was the father of the poetry of rebellion in Russian. And we should bear in mind as well that he was actually sent into exile to Odessa, to this much more liberal city. So there are so many paradoxes, and that's the real world. Unfortunately, the fact that there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians dying in this war means that it's very hard to take a step back and to see how things are going to develop in a kind of from our let's say Western liberal perspective. It's going to be very, very difficult. But I just, as I've said, I really hope that Ukraine will be able to emerge from this war as a stronger European, wonderfully rich, culturally and linguistically rich country.
Yeah, so can you explain to us the significance of this beautiful building that we're sitting here in front of?
This is the State Opera. It was originally built in 1882, and it was built as the German theatre, or the German language theatre of Prague. This was the time of the Czech national revival. By the time it was built, Prague was an overwhelmingly Czech-speaking city, and it was very confidently Czech, as we can see in this other building here, which is the National Museum.
And so you mentioned was built in 1880, right?
It's built in the 1880s as well, so they're built at roughly the same time. And as you can see, it's a much bigger building, a much more confident building.
Yes.
This, at the time, towards the end of the 19th century, in terms of population, there would have been around about 40,000 German speakers in Prague. The total population of the city was nearly 1 million.
Oh, okay, so
there was an overwhelmingly Czech-speaking city, but with this very rich seam of German-speaking, German language culture. So there was some pretty good theatre going on. There was some fantastic music happening. Gustav Mahler conducted in this building, who was also originally from Bohemia. And what's so fascinating is that after the First World War, when Czechoslovakia came into being, this continued as the German theatre, and it became, to no small extent, the theatre of Prague's German-speaking Jewish community. And many of the people who helped to keep the theatre going, because it was not getting the state subsidies that the Czech theatres were getting, were Jewish.
Okay.
And that's one of them built this building right opposite. His name was Julius Peček. He was a Jewish German-speaking banker, and he built this rather magnificent palace, and he put a great deal of money into the German theatre in Prague. It's a symbol of the tragedy of Czech history in the 20th century. That, of course, what happened after Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany, in neighbouring Germany, a lot of German artists, theatre people, actors, writers, opera singers, conductors came to Prague. This actually brought a lot of energy into the National Theatre, into the German theatre. But just a few years later, of course, the city was occupied. And the Peček family managed to escape just in time. But by a tragic irony, their palace, this building right in front of us, became the headquarters of the Gestapo. And to this day, there are some of the cells are still in place where people were tortured throughout the Second World War, throughout the occupation. Only about 10% of Prague's, or today's Czech Republic's Jewish population survived the war.
Yeah.
Then came the end of the war, and there was a huge backlash against the German language. Germans were expelled, and this building here, the German theatre, became what it is today, the State Opera.
Yeah.
And today, if you were to ask people in Prague, very few would have a kind of collective memory that this once was the German theatre of Prague. It is gradually changing. There is more and more interest in the history of the German theatre, and also the fact that a big part of its history is also part of the history of Jewish Prague, which people tend to forget.
Yes.
They tend to think of this as the Czech-German national conflict, whereas it's much more complicated.
Yeah, so we really have this kind of snapshot of Czech history over the 19th, 20th centuries, and including this kind of tragic history right here on this.
There's even a bit more history. The building in between the State Opera and the National Museum is the building of the former Czechoslovak Federal Assembly.
Okay.
Which no longer exists, of course, because Czechoslovakia no longer exists. So we've got another little piece in the mosaic.
Yeah.
So this country has, and this city has many layers.
This interrelationship between Czechs, Germans, with the added complications you mentioned, including the German-speaking Jewish population. We've got this tragic history for much of the 20th century. But, if we come again to the present now, the Czech Republic, Germany, both countries are firmly embedded within the European Union, right? So has this resolved their national tensions?
The Czech Republic and Germany have very, very good relations. They're very close. There are no outstanding problems at the moment on a larger scale. And there are many reasons for that. One of them is the simple fact of borders having opened, and suddenly there's far more interaction, there's far more understanding, recognition of the similarities as well as the differences between the two nations, or you could say more than two nations, because of course there's also the German-speaking Austria as well to the south. But obviously there is the trauma of the past. Yeah. It's there. There are always tensions which can bubble to the surface, and they do every now and then. Politicians on both sides occasionally will take advantage of those national sensitivities, quite often without justification, sometimes with an element of justification. The fact that the Czech Republic and Germany in 1997 signed a declaration of friendly relations between the two countries I was quite surprised it was of more than just symbolic significance. It really did move things on, because there were things that lingered from the past. There was the lingering question of the Sudeten Germans and the Germans who were expelled from Czechoslovakia.
The Beneš decrees.
Yes, the Beneš decrees, the Germans who were expelled after the Second World War, who lost their citizenship, their property. It was always a lingering problem. It's still there under the surface, but it's not really a major issue. And there is also, for the first time, and I'm very pleased to see this, in the Czech Republic itself, there is a growing openness and an interest in the German part of the country's history. And young people, there's been a lot of literature, a lot of books written about it in the last few years. Young people are often sort of interested in who used to live in the town I live in, people who live in the formerly German towns on the borderlands. And that's, I think, a very healthy process.
Yes.
There's still, I think, a slight tendency in Germany to look down a little bit on on the Czechs and the Slovaks as a kind of as a post-communist nation. I'm talking particularly about West Germany. There's still that label which Czechs find a bit annoying, and I think justifiably they find it a bit annoying. It's also always the question of bigger nations and smaller nations, and there's always going to be that tension. One thing I would like to stress is that just because Czech-German relations are currently very good, it doesn't mean that there aren't underlying problems, and that there aren't underlying tensions in both countries, and things, resentments that can, under certain circumstances, re-emerge. I mean, I can imagine a situation, for example, imagine if Volkswagen, which currently owns the main Czech car maker, Škoda, imagine if they were to get into difficulty and they faced a dilemma. Do we close down a factory in Germany or in the Czech Republic? And they decided to close down a factory in the Czech Republic. Just imagine the sentiment that could emerge from an economic decision like that. Imagine the pressures that Volkswagen would be under not to close the factory in Germany. Imagine the trauma that would emerge in this country if that factory were to be closed down here and there were to be thousands of Czechs left unemployed because of a German employer. These are dangers, these are things that both countries really need to think about as potential dangers. Where are these fault lines where things can go wrong again?
I mean, I suppose to take a different example, we saw in the Euro crisis between Germany and Greece how, something that's an economic problem, conflict, right, that very easily, right, the wounds of World War II come up. Right?
Exactly.
Do you have a view on, what the European Union, I mean, the European Union is this multinational, right? It combines, it was kind of created after the Second World War, of course, partly in response to that and this idea that we can never go back to that kind of ethnic nationalism, right? So what can the European Union, do you think, offer Ukraine, right, in helping it to emerge as a self-confident but liberal nation, right, adhering to certain values? What kind of support do you think the EU could offer?
Well, looking at the experiences of the Czech Republic, I think that we shouldn't underestimate how important the process of joining the European Union was to the transformation of this country. It set a very clear goal. The process had a series of steps which involved all sorts of democratic and institutional and economic reforms which the Czech Republic had to fulfill. And it gave that a very clear framework, which really had a process when people were very confused, when there was a lot that people were concerned about, people were uncertain about the future. It was a guideline. It offered a clear goal.
Yeah.
And then the Czech Republic joined the European Union, and of course everybody became increasingly skeptical and cynical, but I think that's quite natural as well. But I think that is the crucial thing. I think that if the European Union offers Ukraine a clear path towards membership, not an ambiguous path toward membership, which I really fear could happen.
Unfortunately, it has a tendency to
it has a tendency because it's having to juggle with a lot of different countries. But I think if it manages to offer a clear path to membership with, and we're already seeing in Ukraine that President Zelensky is already showing a growing commitment to fighting corruption, which I admire in the middle of a war.
This is the
that
thing.
He's actually finding
to
space.
to a reform program during a war
is
quite,
admirable. And I think that deserves to be rewarded, and it deserves to be supported and in the long run. And I think that is probably the lesson that I would see for Ukraine from the Czech Republic's path towards joining the European Union. I think it's going to be much harder, not just because Ukraine is going to be in a very difficult position, especially if it doesn't regain all its lost territory.
Yes.
Also, the European Union, the countries of the European Union are less idealistic than they were in the 1990s.
It's kind of moment of liberal triumph as well and truly past.
Yeah, and so there are a lot of danger signs even within the European Union. But I think that things can work. I think we should always be aware that the status quo can also change. You know, that the European Union can change. Even I was profoundly sad when Britain left the European Union, the country that I grew up in and of which I'm still a citizen as well as being a Czech. But Britain hasn't stopped being a democratic nation as a result of leaving the European Union. It's followed a different path. There are all sorts of challenges that it's facing for the future, but we shouldn't see the future through the sort of a set-in aspect as we see the present.
Okay, and yeah, I think we can finish there. So thank you very much, David. That was really interesting.
Thank you for talking to me. Thank you.